I've calculated orbital trajectories for missions carrying human beings 250 miles above Earth. I've designed redundant safety systems that keep astronauts alive in the vacuum of space. But nothing prepared me for the fury I felt watching my 9-year-old daughter, Sofia, struggle to navigate our front steps because the HOA had declared her wheelchair ramp a neighborhood eyesore. They thought they were dealing with just another suburban parent. They were actually targeting someone whose job requires solving impossible problems with mathematical certainty. And I was about to apply that same precision to dismantling their illegal harassment campaign. Picture this: 7:15 a.m., perfect Houston morning in Willowbrook Estates, and I'm watching my daughter attempt to wheel herself up our front steps because someone had removed the modular ramp sections during the night. The sound of wheelchair wheels scraping against concrete mixed with Sofia's frustrated breathing as she tried to maintain her independence despite someone's deliberate sabotage. Behind me, the smell of coffee and pancakes from my wife Maria's kitchen couldn't mask the metallic taste of rage building in my throat. What would you do if someone targeted your disabled child's basic access to their own home? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let me know. I guarantee some of you have dealt with HOA bullies who think their aesthetic preferences trump federal disability law. Let me back up and tell you how a NASA aerospace engineer ended up at war with suburban terrorists, because this story starts with the most devastating diagnosis any parent can face and ends with the kind of federal justice that only comes when you mess with someone who designs spacecraft for a living. My name is Miguel Gonzalez, 44 years old, and for the past 15 years I've been designing life support systems for NASA missions to the International Space Station. Every morning, I drive 23 miles from our home in Willowbrook Estates to Johnson Space Center, where I work on problems that would make most people's heads spin: orbital mechanics, propulsion calculations, radiation shielding. That's my daily routine. When astronauts depend on systems I've engineered to keep them alive in the most hostile environment imaginable, you develop a very specific mindset about precision, reliability, and zero tolerance for failure. 3 years ago, our world changed forever when Sofia was diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy. At 6 years old, our vibrant, brilliant daughter, who loved dance classes and playground adventures, suddenly needed a wheelchair to maintain her mobility. The medical terminology was overwhelming: progressive muscle weakness, motor neuron degeneration, adaptive equipment requirements. But the reality was simple and heartbreaking. Our little girl needed help accessing the world that most people take for granted. Maria, my wife of 12 years and a pediatric physical therapist at Texas Children's Hospital, immediately began researching accessibility modifications for our home. Her professional background in adaptive equipment meant she understood exactly what Sofia would need: properly graded ramps, widened doorways, accessible bathroom fixtures, and emergency evacuation protocols. As a NASA engineer, I approached it like any other mission-critical system design: comprehensive analysis, regulatory compliance, and implementation with redundant safety margins. The ramp system I designed and installed wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. Aircraft-grade aluminum construction with non-slip surfacing, integrated LED lighting for night safety, and a modular design that could be adjusted as Sofia's mobility needs evolved. The slope met ADA guidelines precisely: 1 inch of rise for every 12 inches of length, with level landings every 30 feet, and proper handrail specifications. Total cost: $8,000 and 60 hours of engineering time spread over 2 months of weekend construction. But most importantly, it gave Sofia her independence back. Watching her wheel herself up that ramp every morning, backpack loaded with homework and art supplies, her face bright with the confidence that comes from controlling your own mobility, that was worth every calculation, every permit application, every late night in the garage cutting aluminum to precise specifications. For 18 months, life was good. Sofia adapted to her mobility equipment with the resilience that only children possess. She made friends in the neighborhood, participated in adaptive sports programs, and maintained straight A's in her accelerated learning classes. Maria and I felt like we'd successfully navigated the most challenging chapter of our family's story. That was before Patricia Whitman moved to Willowbrook Estates. Patricia arrived from California with the kind of aggressive entitlement that comes from people who've never had their assumptions challenged by reality. 52 years old, recently divorced, and immediately obsessed with what she called community standards and property values. Within 3 weeks of buying the largest house on Maple Street, she'd filed 17 separate complaints with the management company about various neighborhood deficiencies. The first time I met Patricia, she was standing in my driveway at 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning, holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who'd discovered a serious violation of natural law. She was average height, with bottle blonde hair, styled in what Maria called the Suburban dictator special, perfectly straightened and sprayed into submission. Her outfit suggested she'd dressed for a business meeting rather than a neighborhood conversation. Navy blazer, white blouse, and low heels that clicked authoritatively against our concrete driveway. "You must be the Gonzalez family," she announced without introducing herself. "I'm Patricia Whitman, the new Architectural Review Committee chairperson. We need to discuss your non-compliant accessibility structure." She gestured towards Sofia's ramp, with the kind of disdain usually reserved for active crime scenes. The metallic clicking of her pen against the clipboard created an oddly rhythmic percussion that immediately set my teeth on edge. "That's my daughter's wheelchair ramp," I replied carefully, already sensing this conversation was heading somewhere unpleasant. "It's medically necessary equipment installed according to ADA specifications." "I understand you have special circumstances," Patricia continued, her voice carrying the fake sympathy that people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "But Willowbrook Estates has very specific architectural guidelines designed to protect our property values. That structure violates our uniformity standards, creates visual pollution, and, according to our covenant restrictions, requires removal within 30 days. The morning air suddenly felt thinner, like standing on a launch pad when the oxygen gets sucked away by ignition. My engineering training kicked in automatically. Assess the problem, identify variables, calculate potential solutions. But the parental protection instinct was overriding systematic analysis with something much more primitive. "Show me the specific covenant language," I said, keeping my voice level despite the volcanic pressure building in my chest. Patricia produced a thick folder from her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this confrontation. Section 4.7. All exterior modifications must conform to established architectural themes. Section 6.12. Structures visible from public areas require prior approval. Section 8.3. Non-conforming installations subject to removal at owner's expense. I scanned the documents while calculating trajectories for Patricia's immediate future that would make orbital mechanics look simple by comparison. The covenant language was deliberately vague, written by lawyers who specialized in maximum flexibility for enforcement, while providing minimum protection for homeowners. "This ramp is federally protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act," I explained. "HOA covenants cannot override federal law regarding accessibility modifications." "That's a common misconception," Patricia replied, with the confidence of someone who'd clearly researched this topic extensively. "While federal law prohibits discrimination, it doesn't require communities to accept modifications that substantially alter neighborhood character. We're prepared to work with you on alternative solutions that meet your daughter's needs while preserving our aesthetic standards." Alternative solutions? Portable ramps that can be stored out of sight when not in use. Interior modifications that don't impact exterior appearance. Professional landscaping to minimize visual impact. There are many options that don't require permanent installation of industrial equipment. The phrase industrial equipment hit me like debris from a failed launch. This woman was describing my daughter's medically necessary mobility access as industrial equipment. The same precision engineering that kept astronauts alive was being categorized as neighborhood eyesore by someone whose greatest technical achievement was probably programming a smart thermostat. "Mrs. Whitman," I said, my voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that Mission Control uses during emergency procedures. "That ramp ensures my daughter's safe access to our home. It's not going anywhere." "I was hoping we could resolve this amicably," Patricia replied, her tone shifting from fake sympathy to undisguised threat. "But if you choose to be uncooperative, the Architectural Review Committee has enforcement authority, including fines, legal action, and ultimately foreclosure proceedings for persistent violations." She handed me a formal notice printed on official letterhead. Architectural compliance violation. Unauthorized exterior modification. The document demanded removal of the non-conforming accessibility structure within 30 days or face escalating financial penalties beginning at $1,000 per month. After Patricia clicked her way back down our driveway, I stood there holding that notice and feeling the same disorientation that astronauts describe during their first experience with zero gravity. Everything looked the same, but fundamental physics had apparently changed without warning. Maria found me 20 minutes later, still standing in the driveway, staring at the document that suggested our daughter's basic mobility access was somehow negotiable. "What's that about?" she asked, though the expression on my face probably telegraphed the answer before I could speak. I handed her the violation notice and watched her professional composure, the same calm competence she used with families facing devastating pediatric diagnoses, temporarily crack around the edges. "They want to remove Sofia's ramp?" Her voice carried the particular kind of disbelief that parents experience when they encounter people who view their child's medical equipment as optional accessories. Apparently, it violates their aesthetic standards. Maria read through the entire document twice, her physical therapy training automatically analyzing the legal and medical implications. "Miguel, this is completely illegal. The Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, federal civil rights law, they can't do this." "I know, but Patricia Whitman seems very confident about their enforcement authority." "Patricia Whitman doesn't understand what she's dealing with," Maria said, her voice carrying the same quiet intensity I used when explaining mission parameters to astronaut crews. "She's about to learn that targeting disabled children brings consequences she hasn't calculated." Over the next week, I did what any good engineer does when facing an unknown problem: comprehensive research and systematic analysis. I reviewed every document in our HOA file, studied federal accessibility law, and consulted with 3 different attorneys who specialized in disability rights. The legal picture became crystal clear very quickly. The Fair Housing Act prohibits housing discrimination based on disability and specifically protects reasonable modifications necessary for disabled residents to use and enjoy their homes. The Americans with Disabilities Act extends those protections and establishes that accessibility modifications are not subject to HOA aesthetic restrictions when medically necessary. Federal law explicitly overrides local covenants in cases involving disability accommodation. But Patricia Whitman wasn't interested in federal law. She was interested in control. 2 weeks after our initial confrontation, I discovered she'd been conducting what she called compliance inspections throughout the neighborhood. Armed with her clipboard and measuring tape, Patricia was documenting every possible covenant violation she could identify. Mailboxes 6 inches too tall, lawn ornaments exceeding size restrictions, exterior paint colors outside the approved palette. Her strategy was becoming obvious: establish enforcement credibility with minor violations before targeting the high-profile accessibility modification that she viewed as the ultimate threat to her vision of suburban perfection. The morning Patricia's enforcement campaign reached Sofia directly was the morning everything changed. I was in my home office reviewing propulsion calculations for the Artemis lunar program when Maria's voice carried up the stairs with the kind of urgency that immediately stops all other activity. "Miguel, you need to see this right now." I found them on the front porch, Maria kneeling beside Sofia's wheelchair, both of them staring at orange traffic cones that had been placed at the top and bottom of the ramp during the night. A printed notice was zip-tied to the upper handrail. "Safety hazard. Unauthorized use prohibited pending compliance review." Sofia was crying, not the dramatic tears of childhood disappointment, but the quiet, bewildered sadness of a 9-year-old trying to understand why someone would make it impossible for her to get into her own house. "Daddy, I can't get up the steps," she said, her voice small and confused. "Why did someone block my ramp?" The fury that hit me in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced in 15 years of high-stress aerospace work. During launch sequences, equipment failures, and mission emergencies, I'd learned to channel adrenaline into analytical problem-solving. But watching my daughter's independence deliberately sabotaged by someone who viewed her mobility equipment as a neighborhood inconvenience triggered something much more primitive than engineering training: I removed the traffic cones and helped Sofia navigate the ramp, while Maria documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. Then, I called Patricia Whitman. "Mrs. Whitman, you placed traffic cones on my daughter's wheelchair ramp." The Architectural Review Committee determined that structure poses safety risks pending our compliance investigation, she replied, with the casual indifference of someone discussing municipal garbage collection. "We're protecting the community from liability exposure. You're preventing a disabled child from accessing her home. I'm enforcing community standards that protect property values for all residents. Your daughter's special needs don't override our collective rights." "My daughter's special needs are protected by federal law." "We'll see about that. The management company has been very supportive of our enforcement initiatives, and we have legal counsel who specializes in covenant compliance. I suggest you begin planning alternative arrangements." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding a phone and staring at my daughter's ramp like it was a launch system that had just suffered catastrophic failure. But Patricia Whitman had made a critical error in her threat assessment. She was dealing with someone whose job involved solving problems that exist at the intersection of advanced mathematics, federal regulations, and life-or-death consequences. Someone who held top-secret security clearance and had direct access to government agencies that most people only hear about on the news. Someone who'd spent 15 years learning exactly how federal authority works when civilian lives are at stake. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Rebecca Martinez at the NASA Office of Equal Opportunity and Inclusion. Rebecca and I had worked together on several accessibility compliance issues at Johnson Space Center, and her background in disability rights law was exactly what this situation required. "Miguel, what they're doing is completely illegal," she confirmed after I described Patricia's enforcement campaign. "This is textbook housing discrimination under federal civil rights law. The Justice Department prosecutes cases like this aggressively." "What kind of timeline are we looking at for federal intervention?" "With documentation like you're describing, probably 60 to 90 days for a formal investigation. But there are faster options if they continue escalating." The second call was to David Kim, my contact at the Federal Aviation Administration, who handled security clearance reviews for NASA contractors. David's expertise in federal regulatory enforcement had been invaluable during previous compliance audits. "You're dealing with people who don't understand the federal system," David explained. "They think local covenants give them authority over federally protected rights. That's a dangerous misconception when they're targeting someone with your clearance level and government connections." "What kind of federal response should I expect?" "Depends how far they push it. Housing discrimination against disabled children. That brings Department of Justice attention very quickly. And when they discover you're a cleared contractor working on national security projects, this becomes a much higher priority case." The third call was to someone whose name I can't mention for security reasons, but whose position at the Department of Housing and Urban Development gave him oversight authority for federal civil rights enforcement. "Miguel, send me everything you've documented. Names, dates, photographs, correspondence. I want a complete record of their harassment campaign. We take disability discrimination cases very seriously, especially when they target children." "What kind of consequences are we talking about?" Federal civil rights violations carry serious penalties. Individual fines up to $50,000, organizational liability in the hundreds of thousands, and potential criminal charges for systematic discrimination. Plus, any legal costs your family incurs become their financial responsibility under federal fee-shifting provisions. How long before they understand what they're dealing with? Usually about 30 seconds after they receive their first letter from Justice Department attorneys. Amazing how quickly people discover federal law when it's being explained by prosecutors. While I was building a federal case against Patricia's harassment campaign, she was escalating her enforcement efforts against our family with the systematic precision of someone who'd clearly done this before. 5 days after the traffic cone incident, Sofia and I returned from her physical therapy appointment to discover that someone had applied official-looking stickers to every section of her wheelchair ramp. Violation notice, removal required. The stickers were apparently designed to be permanent, leaving residue that required chemical solvents to remove completely. But Patricia's escalation didn't stop with vandalism. She organized a community safety meeting in the clubhouse. Maria attended without invitation, recording everything. Patricia had prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled Protecting Property Values Through Architectural Compliance, with photographs of Sofia's ramp and analysis of how accessibility modifications negatively impact neighborhood aesthetics. The most disturbing element was Patricia's systematic dehumanization of our family. She referred to Sofia as the disabled child throughout the presentation and described our modifications as medical equipment installations that violate residential standards. She never once used Sofia's name. 12 residents attended, and Patricia's manipulation was methodical. She showed fabricated property value comparisons, presented false insurance liability statistics, and distributed template letters demanding enforcement action against our family. But Patricia's most calculated move came when she approached Sofia directly. I was reviewing orbital mechanics when I heard Sofia crying on the front porch. Looking out, I saw Patricia kneeling beside Sofia's wheelchair, speaking in fake concerned tones. I was outside in seconds. Mrs. Whitman, step away from my daughter. I was explaining to Sofia that there are alternative mobility solutions that wouldn't require such visible modifications. Patricia replied. Poor thing doesn't understand why her special equipment is causing problems. Sofia was sobbing. Daddy, she said my ramp is making people mad, and maybe I should just crawl up the steps so everyone can be happy. The fury that hit me was unlike anything in 15 years of aerospace work. Watching an adult manipulate my disabled daughter into believing she was the problem triggered something far beyond engineering training. Mrs. Whitman, you will never speak to my daughter again. Get off my property right now. The next morning brought a new escalation. Patricia had filed a formal complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office, claiming that our unauthorized construction violated municipal building codes and created safety hazards for pedestrians. The complaint was completely fabricated. I had all the required permits. The construction met or exceeded all applicable codes, and the ramp actually improved pedestrian safety by providing better lighting and clearer sight lines. But Patricia was clearly hoping that multiple enforcement agencies would create enough pressure to force compliance with her demands. What she didn't understand was that filing false complaints with municipal authorities while targeting disabled children is exactly the kind of escalation that triggers federal intervention. 2 days later, Patricia received her first official correspondence from the U.S. Department of Justice. The letter was delivered by certified mail, required signature confirmation, and came from the Civil Rights Division's Housing and Civil Enforcement section. The language was precise, professional, and unmistakably threatening. The United States has received information suggesting that individuals associated with the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association may be engaged in discriminatory practices that violate the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Specifically, we have documented evidence of attempts to prevent reasonable accessibility modifications necessary for a disabled child's access to her family home. The letter outlined potential penalties for federal civil rights violations, individual liability up to $50,000 per violation, organizational fines in excess of $100,000, court-ordered injunctions requiring compliance with federal accessibility law, and mandatory sensitivity training for all HOA board members. It also included a deadline. All harassment of the Gonzalez family must cease immediately, and Patricia had 14 days to respond in writing with documentation of corrective measures. Patricia's response was swift and predictably hostile. She called our house that evening, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. Mr. Gonzalez, I don't know what connections you think you have, but we're not intimidated by federal bureaucrats who don't understand local property law. Mrs. Whitman, those aren't bureaucrats. Those are Justice Department prosecutors who specialize in civil rights enforcement. We have excellent legal representation, and they've assured us that HOA covenants are legally enforceable regardless of federal preferences. This isn't over. No, it's not. But it's about to change direction in ways you haven't anticipated. She hung up, and I spent the rest of the evening updating my federal contacts on Patricia's continued defiance of Justice Department warnings. The response came faster than anyone expected. 3 weeks after Patricia received her first federal letter, FBI agents knocked on her door at 6:30 a.m. with a search warrant. They discovered files on 47 families with disabled members across 3 communities. Patricia's documentation was methodical. Photographs of accessibility modifications, detailed notes on family routines, and strategic plans for pressuring disabled residents to relocate. The investigation escalated to federal conspiracy charges. Patricia doubled down with criminal stupidity, spray painting eyesore across Sofia's ramp at 2:15 a.m. while under federal investigation. The video evidence was devastating. Clear footage of Patricia vandalizing medically necessary equipment while facing federal civil rights charges. But Patricia made her most catastrophic mistake when she filed false complaints with Child Protective Services, claiming our home modifications endangered Sofia. She also filed false police reports and contacted NASA security, claiming I was using my clearance to intimidate citizens. Each false report was a separate federal felony. The CPS investigation lasted 47 minutes. The caseworker immediately recognized Patricia's complaint as malicious harassment and forwarded everything to the FBI. The morning that federal prosecutors filed formal charges against Patricia Whitman, she made her final catastrophic decision. Instead of hiring qualified legal counsel or negotiating a plea agreement, she decided to represent herself in federal court. Patricia apparently believed that her internet research into property law qualified her to argue constitutional issues before federal judges who'd spent decades interpreting civil rights legislation. The result was a legal disaster that would have been comedy if it weren't destroying a woman's entire future. During her initial arraignment, Patricia interrupted the federal judge to explain that HOA covenants supersede federal recommendations regarding accessibility modifications. When the judge attempted to clarify that federal law overrides local agreements in civil rights cases, Patricia argued that property rights are more fundamental than disability accommodation. The transcript from that hearing became legendary among federal prosecutors who handle civil rights cases. Patricia had essentially confessed to willful discrimination while arguing that federal law didn't apply to her personal preferences about neighborhood aesthetics. What Patricia didn't understand was that her case was being monitored by civil rights organizations across the country as a potential landmark prosecution. The National Disability Rights Network had filed amicus briefs supporting our family, and the case was being taught in law schools as an example of how not to defend against federal civil rights charges. Her pretrial motions became increasingly desperate and legally incoherent. Patricia filed a 37-page document arguing that wheelchair ramps constituted architectural terrorism against communities that had invested in visual harmony. She claimed that federal accessibility law violated the constitutional rights of homeowners to maintain property values through aesthetic control. Federal prosecutors described her legal arguments as fundamentally detached from constitutional reality and requested additional psychological evaluation to determine if Patricia understood the nature of the charges against her. During the 3 months leading up to trial, Patricia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She attempted to file restraining orders against FBI agents, claimed that NASA was involved in a conspiracy to weaponize disability rights, and submitted court documents suggesting that I was using my security clearance to persecute normal Americans who believe in property rights. The federal judge ordered mandatory psychological evaluation after Patricia filed a motion, claiming that Sofia's wheelchair was actually a surveillance device being used to monitor neighborhood activities for federal agencies. The evaluation confirmed that Patricia was competent to stand trial, but revealed what prosecutors described as severe narcissistic personality disorder with delusional features related to authority and control. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation had expanded far beyond our family's case. Agents discovered that Patricia had been systematically targeting disabled residents throughout 3 different communities over the past 8 years. Her files contained detailed surveillance notes on families with disabled children, photographs of accessibility modifications, and strategic plans for pressuring families into moving away from neighborhoods she considered aesthetically compromised. The investigation revealed that Patricia had successfully forced at least 12 families with disabled members to sell their homes and relocate to avoid her harassment campaigns. Her methods included filing false police reports, organizing neighborhood pressure campaigns, and manipulating HOA enforcement to make life unbearable for families who refused to remove accessibility modifications. Federal prosecutors upgraded the charges to include racketeering violations under the RICO Act, recognizing Patricia's activities as part of an organized crime enterprise, ongoing criminal enterprise designed to systematically exclude disabled individuals from certain residential communities. The enhanced charges carried potential sentences exceeding 20 years in federal prison. Federal Judge Maria Santos, who'd presided over civil rights cases for 12 years, later described Patricia's courtroom performance as one of the most comprehensive examples of criminal self-incrimination I've witnessed in my judicial career. The trial lasted 3 days and included testimony from FBI investigators, Justice Department civil rights attorneys, disability rights experts, and our family. Sofia testified via video conference from our home, describing how Patricia's harassment had made her afraid that someone would take away the ramp she needed to access her own house. The prosecution presented a devastating case that extended far beyond our family's experience. FBI investigators had uncovered Patricia's systematic targeting of disabled residents across multiple communities, revealing a pattern of deliberate discrimination that shocked even experienced civil rights prosecutors. Agent Jennifer Walsh, who'd led the investigation, testified that Patricia's files contained detailed surveillance information on 43 families with disabled members across 3 different states. Her documentation included photographs of accessibility modifications, notes on family routines, and strategic plans for pressuring disabled residents to relocate. In 20 years of investigating civil rights violations, I've never encountered such systematic and premeditated discrimination, Agent Walsh testified. Miss Whitman didn't just target individual families, she developed and implemented comprehensive strategies specifically designed to exclude disabled individuals from residential communities. The evidence included recordings of Patricia coaching other HOA board members on methods for circumventing federal accessibility law, including how to use architectural review processes to delay approvals until families exhausted their financial resources, fighting compliance battles. Most damaging was Patricia's own testimony. Against her attorney's advice, she insisted on taking the stand to explain her community improvement philosophy. Her 3 hours of testimony provided prosecutors with comprehensive admissions of intentional discrimination that eliminated any possibility of claiming ignorance or misunderstanding of federal law. I believe that communities have the right to maintain standards that protect property values, Patricia testified. If that means certain types of people choose to live elsewhere, that's their decision, not discrimination. When asked to clarify what she meant by certain types of people, Patricia's response was recorded for legal history. People whose special accommodations interfere with normal neighborhood aesthetics. People who expect communities to modify their standards to accommodate medical equipment and accessibility devices. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, methodically walked Patricia through her own files, forcing her to acknowledge each instance of targeting families specifically because they had disabled members. Her attempts to justify systematic discrimination as community standards enforcement provided prosecutors with textbook examples of intentional civil rights violations. The jury deliberated for 37 minutes. Patricia Whitman was convicted on 11 federal charges: civil rights violations, housing discrimination, property destruction, witness intimidation, filing false police reports, filing false reports with Child Protective Services, conspiracy to violate civil rights, racketeering under the RICO Act, and 4 separate counts of criminal harassment targeting disabled children. The conviction was unanimous on all charges, with jury foreman David Park later stating that Patricia's own testimony had eliminated any doubt about her intentional discrimination against disabled residents. Following the conviction, federal investigators expanded their inquiry to include the management companies and legal firms that had enabled Patricia's discrimination campaigns. 3 HOA management companies faced federal civil rights law solutions, and 2 attorneys lost their professional licenses for providing legal advice on circumventing accessibility law. The sentencing hearing revealed the full scope of Patricia's criminal campaign against disabled families throughout multiple communities. FBI investigators presented evidence that she'd successfully forced 47 families with disabled members to sell their homes and relocate to avoid her harassment campaigns over an 8-year period. Victim impact statements were read from families across 3 states who'd been targeted by Patricia's systematic discrimination. Parents described children with disabilities who'd lost confidence, families who'd exhausted their savings, fighting illegal HOA enforcement, and disabled individuals who'd been traumatized by organized harassment campaigns. Dr. Sarah Kim, a disability rights expert who'd studied Patricia's case, testified about the broader implications of systematic housing discrimination against disabled individuals. Her research revealed that Patricia's methods had been copied by HOA boards across the country, creating what she termed accessibility apartheid in suburban communities. Federal Judge Santos sentenced Patricia to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 10 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution for all legal costs, property damage, and punitive damages totaling $2.7 million to the 47 families she'd targeted. During sentencing, Judge Santos explained that Patricia's crimes represented one of the most systematic and premeditated civil rights conspiracies prosecuted in this district, and that federal law demands severe consequences for adults who organize campaigns of terror against disabled children and their families. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was permanently dissolved by federal court order, and all former board members were banned from serving in any HOA capacity for life. The management company settled a separate federal lawsuit for $8.5 million, which established a national legal fund for families facing housing discrimination based on disability. But the most significant outcome was the federal legislation inspired by our family's case. During sentencing, Judge Santos explained that Patricia's crimes represented a particularly egregious example of targeting vulnerable individuals protected by federal civil rights law, and that society has zero tolerance for adults who deliberately traumatize disabled children to advance their personal aesthetic preferences. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was dissolved by court order, and all residents received federally mandated training on disability rights and accessibility law. The management company settled a separate federal lawsuit for $2.3 million, which established a legal fund for families facing housing discrimination based on disability. But the most satisfying outcome was watching Sofia regain her confidence and independence after months of harassment from someone who viewed her medical equipment as a neighborhood inconvenience. 2 years later, Sofia's ramp remains exactly where I installed it, and she uses it every morning to wheel herself to the school bus, with the same bright confidence that made me proud to be her father. She's participating in competitive wheelchair racing, maintaining straight A's in advanced mathematics, and talking about becoming an aerospace engineer like her dad. The Sofia Gonzalez Accessibility Protection Act, named after our daughter, was signed into federal law 18 months after Patricia's conviction. The legislation established enhanced penalties for housing discrimination targeting disabled children, created federal oversight mechanisms for HOA compliance with accessibility law, and provided dedicated funding for families fighting discrimination cases. My testimony before the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties became part of the legislative record supporting the bill. I explained how aerospace engineering principles, systematic analysis, redundant safety systems, and zero tolerance for failure should apply to protecting disabled children's basic rights to access their homes safely. The law has already resulted in successful prosecutions of HOA boards in 12 states, with federal courts awarding over $40 million in damages to families who face systematic discrimination. The precedent established by Patricia's case created a legal framework that prosecutors nationwide use to pursue housing discrimination cases involving accessibility modifications. Sofia testified before Congress via video conference during the final markup session, explaining how the harassment had initially made her afraid that someone could take away her independence, but that seeing adults held accountable for targeting disabled children had restored her confidence in the system designed to protect her rights. The NASA Office of Equal Opportunity and Inclusion developed a training program based on our family's experience, which is now mandatory for all contractors working on aerospace projects. The program emphasizes that employees with security clearances have special responsibilities to understand and defend civil rights protections, particularly when their professional expertise gives them unique access to federal enforcement mechanisms. Johnson Space Center established the Miguel Gonzalez Family Advocacy Program, providing legal support and federal connections for NASA families facing discrimination based on disability status. The program has assisted 37 families over the past 2 years, with federal agencies responding more quickly to discrimination complaints involving cleared contractors working on national security projects. Patricia Whitman is serving her sentence at FCI Tallahassee Federal Correctional Institution, where she's required to complete comprehensive disability sensitivity training as part of her rehabilitation program. Her former house was sold at foreclosure auction to a family with twin sons who have cerebral palsy, and they immediately installed accessibility modifications throughout the property. The federal investigation sparked by her crimes led to sweeping reforms in HOA management practices nationwide. The Department of Housing and Urban Development now maintains a database of HOA boards and management companies with histories of disability discrimination, and federal contractors are prohibited from residing in communities with documented patterns of civil rights violations. 3 documentary films have been produced about our family's case, including one that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and won the Audience Award for Best Social Justice Documentary. Sofia appeared in the film's epilogue, demonstrating her wheelchair racing technique and explaining her plans to study aerospace engineering so she can design accessibility systems for space stations and lunar bases. The case established federal precedent in 7 different areas of civil rights law and became required reading in law schools across the country. The Harvard Law Review published a comprehensive analysis of the prosecution, concluding that it represented a watershed moment in federal enforcement of housing accessibility rights and a model for systematic prosecution of organized discrimination. International attention from the case led to similar legislative reforms in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, where housing rights organizations cited our family's experience as evidence of the need for stronger protections against systematic exclusion of disabled individuals from residential communities. 5 years after Patricia's conviction, I received a letter from her in federal prison. The handwriting was careful and controlled, suggesting someone who'd spent considerable time crafting each word. Mr. Gonzalez, I am writing to acknowledge the harm I caused your family and to accept full responsibility for my actions. Through mandatory counseling and disability rights education, I have come to understand that my behavior was not about property standards or community aesthetics. It was about my fear and prejudice toward people whose lives I didn't understand. Sofia's courage in facing my harassment while maintaining her dignity has taught me more about strength and character than I learned in 52 years of believing that my comfort was more important than other people's basic rights. I know that apologies cannot undo trauma, but I want you to know that your family's perseverance in seeking justice has prevented other families from experiencing what I put you through. Sofia's advocacy work is inspiring people across the country, and I hope that someday my story can serve as a warning to others about the consequences of targeting vulnerable individuals. Patricia Whitman. I shared the letter with Sofia, who read it carefully and then asked if she could write a response. Her reply, composed entirely on her own, demonstrated the maturity and compassion that had carried her through the most difficult period of her young life. Miss Whitman, thank you for your letter and for taking responsibility for what you did. What happened was scary for me and my family, but it also taught me that fighting for what's right sometimes means standing up to people who seem more powerful than you are. My dad always says that good engineering requires learning from failures so you can build better systems. I hope other people can learn from what happened so that kids like me don't have to worry about adults trying to take away things. We need to be independent. I hope your time in prison helps you understand that disabled people just want the same things everyone else wants: to feel safe in our homes and to be treated with respect. Sofia. Standing in my driveway this morning, watching Sofia demonstrate proper orbital mechanics to her younger cousins using her wheelchair as a teaching tool, I'm reminded why precision engineering principles apply to more than just spacecraft design. When someone threatens your family's basic rights, you approach the problem with the same methodical analysis that keeps astronauts alive in space. Identify the threat, calculate your resources, and execute with mathematical certainty. Sometimes the most important mission isn't sending humans to the International Space Station. It's protecting their right to access their own homes safely. But the story doesn't end with Patricia's imprisonment. The federal precedent established by our case created a legal framework that continues protecting families nationwide from similar discrimination. Within 2 years of the conviction, federal prosecutors had successfully prosecuted HOA boards in 37 states using the legal strategies developed during Patricia's case. The Department of Justice created a dedicated civil rights enforcement unit, specifically focused on housing discrimination against disabled individuals, with funding allocated for rapid response to accessibility harassment complaints. Federal agents now receive specialized training on recognizing systematic discrimination patterns, and the unit maintains a database of HOA boards with histories of targeting disabled residents. Sofia's case inspired the creation of the National Accessibility Advocacy Network, an organization that provides legal support, federal connections, and rapid response capabilities for families facing housing discrimination based on disability status. The network has assisted over 300 families in 2 years, with federal agencies responding within hours to discrimination complaints involving disabled children. The legal precedent established by Patricia's prosecution fundamentally changed how federal courts approach systematic discrimination cases. The conviction demonstrated that organized harassment campaigns targeting disabled individuals constitute federal conspiracy under RICO statutes, opening the door for enhanced prosecution strategies against organizations that facilitate or enable housing discrimination. International attention from our case led to similar legislative reforms in 12 countries, with disability rights organizations worldwide citing our family's experience as a model for federal enforcement of accessibility rights. The European Union adopted similar protections against systematic exclusion of disabled individuals from residential communities, and the United Nations referenced our case in updated guidelines for national disability rights legislation. The NASA Johnson Space Center established the Sofia Gonzalez Accessibility Innovation Lab, where aerospace engineers develop accessibility technologies for both terrestrial and space applications. The lab has produced breakthrough innovations in wheelchair design, adaptive controls for spacecraft, and emergency evacuation systems that protect disabled individuals during natural disasters. Sofia herself has become a national advocate for disability rights, speaking at conferences across the country about the importance of federal civil rights enforcement. At 13 years old, she's maintained straight A's in advanced mathematics and science, continues competing in wheelchair racing at the national level, and has been accepted into NASA's Youth STEM Academy for high-achieving students interested in aerospace careers. The Sofia Gonzalez Accessibility Protection Act was signed into federal law, establishing enhanced penalties for targeting disabled children. Sofia's case became required reading in federal law enforcement training programs. 5 years after Patricia's conviction, I received a letter from her in federal prison acknowledging responsibility for her actions and the harm she'd caused our family and dozens of others. Sofia's response revealed the maturity that had carried her through this ordeal, focusing not on Patricia's punishment, but on her hope that other adults could learn from the experience. The ongoing legacy extends far beyond individual justice. Federal courts continue citing Sofia's case as precedent, and law schools teach it as an example of how individual courage creates systemic change in civil rights protection. Standing in my driveway 7 years later, watching Sofia explain aerospace engineering principles to neighborhood children while demonstrating advanced wheelchair techniques, I'm reminded that when protecting your family's civil rights, failure isn't an option, and federal law provides the tools necessary to ensure mission success against anyone who mistakes temporary authority for permanent power over vulnerable individuals. What's your experience with HOA overreach or disability discrimination? Share your story in the comments below. Sofia and Maria read every comment, and we connect families facing similar challenges with legal resources and federal agencies who take civil rights violations seriously. If this story opened your eyes to federal accessibility law, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell for HOA Revenge Stories. Remember, federal law exists to protect vulnerable individuals from people who mistake temporary authority for permanent power. Sometimes you just need to remind them that precision engineering principles apply to justice as effectively as they do to rocket science. What's your worst HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same battle. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing bullies get what they deserve, and ring that notification bell for more HOA revenge stories where justice is served ice cold. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.